In January, a wind cut through Chicago's tall skyline. Very sharp and not gentle, Sophie Carter pulled her worn-out coat tighter around her, protecting the small bundle that was pressed against her chest. Ethan, her 1-year-old son, stirred a little, and his warm breath touched her neck. She whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's got you." The words turned into mist in the cold air. That morning, her phone rang a third time. She didn't have to look at the screen to know it was Lena, her maid, calling to say she was sick again. Sophie let out a sigh, torn between anger and sadness. Lena wasn't to blame, but that didn't change the truth she had to face. So little time had passed, and no daycare would take Ethan. She also couldn't miss work. Not when rent is due in 4 days. As she ran through the busy streets, the Harrington Industries building stood out in front of her. Its glass front showed the steel glow sky, which was very different from Sophie's hectic life. She had been a cleaner at the big company for 6 months, getting to work early to clean the floors and wipe down desks before the execs even got to their spotless offices. It wasn't exciting, but it paid better than most cleaning jobs, and her boss liked her for it. Even up until now, Angela had been understanding. Sophie's hands were shaking as she swiped her ID card at the service door. Every step Ethan seemed to weigh more in his carrier. She had brought everything she could think of to keep him quiet. Changes the diapers on his favorite toy elephant. Deep down, she knew the risk. If only she could get through this one shift without being seen, she would be happy. If anyone found out she brought her baby to work, especially him, she would not only get in trouble, she would be fired. There would be no going back if she lost this job. No backup plan, just a notice to vacate and an unsure future. Sophie carefully pushed her cleaning cart forward as she got out of the service lift on the executive floor. It was very quiet. Early in the morning, the sun broke through the huge floor-to-ceiling windows and lit up the sleek, modern office space with golden tones. She might have stopped to enjoy the beautiful view of the city on any other day, but today there was no time for that. She planned every move she made. She quickly wiped down surfaces in the reception area before sneaking into the main hallway. With each breath, she said a silent prayer that Ethan would stay asleep. So far, so good. The baby that was on her chest stayed still, his warm breath steady against her neck. She only had to work this one shift. No one would ever need to know. But just as she got to the last place on her list, Ethan woke up. Sophie's heart raced as she instinctively reached for his pacifier and gently pressed it to his lips to try to calm him down. Nathaniel Harrington's office was just as intimidating as he was, absolutely modern and lacking any warmth at all. The dark leather furniture, shiny glass desk, and simple decorations all screamed power and control. Sophie had heard a lot about him from other workers who were talking behind her back. A CEO who was both smart and cruel, who built empires and destroyed competitors without hesitation. She was very cold-hearted and couldn't stand distractions, especially ones like a crying baby. She had just started to clean his desk when Ethan moved again, his little fingers holding on to her sweater. A soft whimper came out of his mouth. Sophie froze, her heart hammering. "Please, baby, just a few more minutes," she whispered, desperately bouncing slightly on the balls of her feet, but Ethan had other plans. His whimper turned into a fuss, and before she could stop it, a loud, piercing wail echoed through the vast office. Panic surged through Sophie as she scrambled for the bottle, the pacifier. Anything to quiet him before the office door slammed open. What the hell is going on here? A deep, authoritative voice sent a jolt of pure fear down her spine. Slowly, Sophie turned, her breath catching as she came face to face with Nathaniel Harrington in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He stood tall and obvious in the doorway. As he looked at what he saw, his sharp, blue eyes narrowed at the sight in front of him, and his face was marked with anger. A cleaner who is shaking, a baby who is crying, and a mess of cleaning supplies at her feet. Sophie saw her whole future flash before her eyes. "Mr. Harrington, I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's cold gaze flicked from her to Ethan, his jaw tightening. "Why is there a child in my office?" His tone was sharp as steel, cutting through Ethan's cries like a blade. Sophie clutched her son. Closer dread pooling in her stomach. She had broken the rules, she had been caught, and now she was about to lose everything. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears as she tightened her grip on Ethan, her mind scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. I had no choice, she managed, her voice barely steady. My maid got sick, and I couldn't find anyone else. I know it's against the rules, but I promise he won't be a bother. I'm going to work twice as hard and stay late. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, I only need this job. Her plea hung in the air, but Nathaniel's face remained unreadable, his sharp blue eyes assessing her with a focus that made her want to shrink into the floor. Ethan, oblivious to the weight of the moment, let out another soft whimper, his tiny hands grasping at Sophie's shirt. To her utter shock, instead of snapping at her or telling security to throw her out, Nathaniel did something completely unexpected. He stepped forward, his gaze changing from Sophie to the baby in her arms. May I? His voice was still controlled, but it had lost its edge and was now filled with something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Sophie was shocked by the request and paused. This was Nathaniel Harrington, the same person who was said to fire workers for small mistakes. The same man whose very presence made everyone in the building shiver with fear. Yet here he was asking to hold her son before she could think about it too much. She slowly nodded and carefully put Ethan in his arms. The way Nathaniel held the baby in his arms was surprisingly easy. His strong hands supported the baby's small body. Ethan, who was still crying, looked up at the person who was holding him and reached out with his fat fingers to grab Nathaniel's collar. Sophie held her breath, ready for her son to say no and cry again. To her shock, Ethan let out a happy sigh and leaned against Nathaniel's chest like he belonged there. Nathaniel looked down at the little boy, but his face couldn't be read. There was something different about the way he stood, almost protective. His voice was getting softer and softer until it was almost gentle. Rough morning, huh? Sophie's heart sank when she saw it. It was so strange and not like him at all. He is known for being cold and efficient. There was, however, an obvious warmth in the way he rocked Ethan, as if he had done it before. For a long moment the office was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. Sophie stood frozen, watching as the most feared man in Chicago held her son with a tenderness that made her chest ache. But then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. When Nathaniel's phone rang in his pocket, it brought him back to the present. His face shook, and the warmth went away as if it had never been there. With care, he gave Ethan back to Sophie and straightened his tie as he left. He said, "You can't bring him into the office again," but his tone wasn't as harsh as before. Sophie's stomach clenched in fear, but before she could say another weak apology, he went on, "There's a corporate daycare in the building next door. It's usually only for executives, but I'll make an exception for you. It will be his place from tomorrow on." I can't afford, I'll cover the cost," Sophie blinked, sure she had heard him wrong. Nathaniel cut in with a firm voice, "Consider it a company benefit." She stared at him, at the man who had every reason to fire her but instead had just offered her a lifeline. Why are you doing this?" She whispered, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. He looked like he might not answer for a moment. She almost didn't hear him when he said, "Because no one should have to choose between their job and their child." Sophie took a deep breath. Nathaniel quickly turned away from her and returned his attention to the huge stack of papers on his desk before she could say anything. The conversation was over, but as she left the office, Ethan still nestled against her. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted between them. Something she didn't fully understand yet told her that Nathaniel Harrington, the man she had feared from the moment she walked into this building, wasn't as heartless as everyone thought. Sophie hadn't planned to see much of Nathaniel after that morning in his office, but they kept running into each other. At first, it seemed like a mistake. The first time they met was when she picked up Ethan from daycare and gave him a polite nod in the hallway. After that, they met more often. He was stooped next to Ethan at daycare one evening, letting the child pull on his silk tie with a chuckled face. Another time, Nathaniel walked in as she was finishing cleaning the executive room. He looked tired and said, "You're avoiding me." She thought for a moment and then said, "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Harrington." He twitched his lips and said, "Nathaniel." The first few times they talked, it was short. There was a nod in the hallway and a quick hello when she picked up Ethan from daycare, but then they became more than that. Nathaniel lingered, asking about Ethan's day and making quiet comments about how tired Sophie looked. Nathaniel laughed one night as Ethan pulled on his silk tie. Sophie was shocked by the sound, and she couldn't help but stare. As they stood by the building's door, his voice broke the silence. "Come to dinner with me." Sophie's heart shook. She should have said no, but she whispered, "Okay," which was wrong. But before that dinner could happen the next day, she met Eleanor Harrington in person. Sophie had dreamed of Nathaniel's mother being everything she was. Beautifully written and incredibly scary, Eleanor didn't waste any time getting to the point over a carefully made cup of tea. "I know women like you, Miss Carter," she said. "You have already gained more than you should have. This job has my son's attention. But just to be clear, this is the end of it." Sophie felt sick to her stomach, but she looked straight into Eleanor's eyes and said, "I'm not after anything." Eleanor had a sharp smile on her face. "After that, you won't mind leaving." She took a checkbook out of her purse and reached in. "Name your price," the remark burned, but Sophie refused to let it show. She stood up and put her cup down. "I think we're done here." Eleanor's eyes got darker. "Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you." Sophie's hands were shaking as she walked away. She was wrong to think Nathaniel was the most dangerous person for her heart. The real danger had just been seen. After her talk with Eleanor, Sophie barely made it through her shift. The woman's words stuck in her mind like poison. Every syllable was a warning that she would never fit in with Nathaniel's world, no matter what she did. But she could handle anything except the thought of losing Ethan. The next morning, that fear came true. She was in the middle of cleaning an office when Diane, the director of the daycare, called her on the phone. "Could Miss Carter please come to my office? We need to talk about something important right away." Sophie was filled with fear as she ran downstairs, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Amy was waiting with two strangers when she got there. Members of the Child Protection Services. It hurt her stomach. "Miss Carter," at the start, one of the social workers kept her tone carefully neutral. Concerns were raised about Ethan's control and well-being in an anonymous report. "We just need to make a few things clear." Sophia's mouth dried up. Eleanor was the only person who could have done this. Sophie was angry for the first time instead of just scared. She tried hard to stay cool, but it was hard. She gave them all the information they asked for and answered all of their questions. But then they asked the one question she had been dreading. "Miss Carter, are you Ethan's real mother?" The room went quiet. Sophia's hands were in her lap, curled into fists. Now was the time when everything could go wrong. She had raised Ethan as if he were her own for a year, but technically he wasn't. With a shaky breath, she told them the truth. Ethan wasn't her son, he was her nephew. Her sister Lucy had been killed in a car accident when Ethan was just a few weeks old with no father in the picture. Sophie had taken him in without hesitation, vowing to protect him no matter what, but she had never gone through the formal adoption process. She had been too overwhelmed, too afraid that someone would tell her she wasn't enough. Now that fear was staring her in the face, the social workers exchanged looks, making notes on their files. Sophie's chest tightened. What if they took him away then? Before anyone else could speak, the office door swung open. "I assume you're here about Ethan." Nathaniel's speech was calm, but there was an edge of danger beneath it. He strode into the room with the power of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. His sharp blue eyes locking onto the social workers. Sophie stared at him with wide eyes. "What's up, Nathaniel?" "I'm here to ease your mind." He got right in there. "Ethan is taken care of and has all the things he needs. And if custody is a problem, there's an easy way to fix it." He turned around to fully face her. Sophie knew right then that something was going to change for good. "Get married to me." The word shook the room. Sophie took a deep breath. What Nathaniel didn't think about: no one will be able to question Ethan's stability if we get married. This will give you the formal right to adopt him without anyone getting in the way. It keeps him safe and keeps you safe. She looked at him. Her mind was racing. Were these things really happening? The social workers moved around uncomfortably. "Mr. Harrington, marriage isn't necessary in a case like this." "I disagree," Nathaniel said in a calm voice. "I have the tools to protect Ethan. No one, not even my mother, could question Sophie's custody if you were my real son." Sophie's heart was beating fast in her ears. You can't just ask someone to marry you like it's a business deal. Nathaniel's face became less angry. It's not a business deal. Sophie, he let out a sigh and ran his hand through his hair. I should have told you sooner, but he thought for a moment. I care more about you and Ethan than I ever thought I could. Not only do I want to keep him safe, but I also want to choose both of you. Sophie's throat got tight. She had spent so long convincing herself that Nathaniel was out of reach, that he belonged to a world where she could never fit in, but right now in this moment he was picking. Her tears stung her eyes. She looked down at Ethan, who was happily playing with Nathaniel's cufflink. Totally unaware of the storm raging around him, she had vowed to protect this little boy at all costs, and maybe, just maybe, Nathaniel Harrington was part of that promise. After taking a big breath, she looked into his eyes and said, yes. Sophie was still excited about Nathaniel's surprise proposal as she stood in his office. You can't just decide that we should get married, she said, crossing her arms. Nathaniel kept his eyes on her. I'm not deciding for you, I'm asking you to choose me, Ethan, us. His voice softened. I know this is fast, but you and Ethan changed me. I never wanted a family before, but now I can't imagine my life without you. Her chest tightened. Could she really do this, marry a man she never expected to know beyond passing glances? But then she looked at Ethan happily playing at Nathaniel's feet, totally safe, and she realized Nathaniel had already become family. She let out a slow breath and whispered, okay. Nathaniel's face showed a flash of surprise that quickly turned into something warmer. Sophie never thought she'd be walking down the aisle of a private loft wedding in a designer dress, but there she was. He kissed her before she could even think twice. The list of guests was short. Eleanor Harrington wasn't there, but that didn't matter because Nathaniel was waiting at the end of the aisle. You look beautiful, he whispered as he took her hands. She smiled. You're not too bad yourself. Sophia knew she was home when Nathaniel kissed her after the short vows. Sophie stood by the door and watched Nathaniel put Ethan to bed gently. The kid was almost asleep. A small hand wrapped around Nathaniel's finger. You're good at that? She asked in a whisper. At what, being a dad? Nathaniel asked her with a small smile on his face. His eyes got softer. He looked at Ethan and then back at her. When he spoke, thanks because he's mine, there was no question in his mind. Sophia could finally feel something settle in her chest. He was, yes. She knew this wasn't just a marriage when